Welcome to the NEC Perspectives Forum. My name is Stanford Thompson, and I graduated from NEC in 2010 from the Sistema Fellows Program. Originally from Atlanta, Georgia, I came to NEC after completing a Bachelor's of Music and Trumpet Performance from the Curtis Institute of Music. In early June, President Kalin appointed me as her special advisor to help NEC respond to the cultural challenges facing the institution. We believe that listening is the first step we need to take this summer, and I'm very excited about the changes that will be implemented in the coming weeks. Tonight marks our third forum of 5 that focuses on the Black experience at NEC. These conversations provide the NEC community the opportunity to explore how we all can help NEC live up to its commitment of cultural equity and belonging. By listening to the experiences and perspectives of our students, alumni, faculty, and staff, we will explore ideas that will have a positive impact on our community and builds a more hopeful future for our current and prospective students. This series is slated to continue in the upcoming academic year, and topics will expand to include the perspectives of our diverse campus. For those joining us on our live stream that want to ask questions, please take a moment now to navigate to the necmusic.edu website, click on Cultural Equity and Belonging under the About tab, and find tonight's event in order to join us on Zoom where questions can be submitted. For anyone else who would like to share their ideas and experiences with NEC, feel free to email us at necmusic.edu. As we discussed last week with Carl Atkins, Susan Calkins, and Ken Shaphorst, the establishment of an African-American music and jazz studies program at NEC influenced the culture of the institution and of teaching and making music across the campus in many ways. In actuality, the new opportunities provided complex challenges beyond the integration of Black Americans in society and integration of musical styles being studied at NEC. The informality of jazz education, hanging out, listening, and talking, provided a space for powerful musical and social dialogue. Joining me this evening, alum Dr. Darryl Harper will lead a thought-provoking session on ethnic identity and artistic self-expression at NEC, and what questions we should examine in today's environment. Darryl has had a 35 career in music performance, composition, teaching, and educational leadership. He is a jazz musician interested in how race, culture, and political economy intersect with music. An associate professor in Amherst College's music department, he teaches courses in jazz history, improvisation, and the live music experience. He is also the director of the Center for Humanistic Inquiry, the college's Humanities Center. Darryl majored in music at Amherst, received a master's in music and jazz studies from Rutgers University, and a doctorate in jazz studies from the New England Conservatory. He has performed more than 300 concerts as a jazz clarinetist in 20 countries. His credits include dates with Dee Dee Bridgewater, Roscoe Mitchell, Dave Holland, Uri Kane, and a 2-year stint with violinist Regina Carter, and his current position as clarinetist in pianist-composer Jason Moran's Harlem Hellfighters project. Darryl has led the small ensemble The Onus since 1996. His projects as a leader also include the C3 Project, a multimedia presentation of music, video, dance, and poetry. As a composer, Darryl has published and recorded more than 24 works. He has co-written a score for the documentary film Herkovitz at the Heart of Blackness, which won the John O'Connor Film Award from the American Historical Society, as well as Best Documentary prizes from the Martha Vineyard's African American Film Festival and the Black Hollywood Film Festival. As an administrator, Darryl led recruitment efforts for diversity and inclusion at George School in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, where he helped to recruit over 1,000 students. He served as the director of the Ward Center for the Arts at the St. Paul's Schools in Baltimore, Maryland, where he oversaw music, theater, dance, and visual arts programs for 1,300 students, kindergarten through 12th grade. He also served for many years as chair of the Department of Music at Virginia's Commonwealth University in Richmond, Virginia. Darryl, thanks so much for being here this evening. You've accomplished a lot in such a short period of time. But I reached out to you several weeks ago because I've read your doctoral studies paper from 2006 that you wrote at NEC entitled An Issue of Black and White, the Genesis and Social Legacy of the Jazz Degree Program at NEC. You did an amazing job of researching, interviewing, and constructing a fair narrative of the institution. And I'm eager to discuss some of your findings from then and where you think NEC could go next. So before we jump into I understand you grew up in Philly, where I've been living for the past 15 years and worked with many of the veteran Philadelphia-based jazz legends I grew up hearing about, like as I was a kid, and many of them who I was lucky to hear when I moved up north. So can you fill us in on some of the highlights of your musical upbringing that put you on that you're on today?
Sure. Well, thanks for inviting me, Stanford. I want to say that first, and thanks to those of you joining us. I loved growing up in Philly. It was a really rich musical environment to grow up in, a really wonderful city. You know, one thing that stands out that I'm sure you've run across in your time there was the Settlement Music School, which is a community music school that provides music instruction for largely for families that wouldn't be able to afford it otherwise. So they have all these subsidies, and that was really wonderful for my family because we wouldn't have been able to afford music lessons without something like Settlement. So that was a huge part of my early education, taking clarinet lessons there, piano, composition, chamber music, playing in an orchestra, in a wind band, you know, all kinds of really rich experiences. And my first jazz teacher was a young trombone player named Tony Hurdle. And he came out of Settlement. He was about 6 years older than I was. And he took me under his wing. So that's how I got into jazz, was kind of following in his footsteps. And, you know, it's one of those typical stories where I wanted to be like him. And I just loved being introduced to this repertory. And at that time, Philadelphia had a full-time jazz station at Temple University, WRTI. So I could literally listen to the music 24 hours a day if I wanted. And it was just a wonderful education, wonderful musical upbringing.
Great. Well, it has certainly changed a little bit, you know, since you've been there. But no, WRTI is still there. And of course, I mean, I think everybody's doing the very best that they can, jazz alive and really kicking. So in your doctoral studies paper, you begin by highlighting how the final years of the civil rights movement encourage higher education to establish Black studies departments, and would also inspire Gunther Schuler in developing a musical equivalent at NEC. How would you describe the impact of Schuler's decision to establish and support the Afro-American Music and Jazz Studies Department?
It was, you know, right in line with what was going on at the time around the country in some ways. So in 1968, there was one Black Studies program in the country. And by 1972, there were 500. And I really see Schuler as riding that wave, and in a very deliberate, just conscious, you know, aware of his environment, in those ways, he was bringing something to the conservatory that was parallel development. And the other thing that I would say about Gunther Schuler is he had done this experiment already because he had been part of the jazz school at Lenox, which for those who don't know is there was this Music Inn, it was called, and it was over in Western Massachusetts, and it became an epicenter for a number of years for concert series. And then out of the concert series developed what they called roundtable discussions. And these were essentially seminar sessions about jazz and other kinds of folk music from around the world. So the guest artists would be part of the roundtables, and Schuler was deeply involved in this, and it eventually became a school for a while. And this was the model that he was carrying forward to the conservatory. So he was actually really conversant in how this might go, how this might work. And then he was also operating in this climate where these kinds of things were starting to emerge around the country in schools, Black studies in particular, but also other jazz programs.
So, in terms of, program up and running, do you remember anything from your research just about any major obstacles that he faced trying to get it going, or for those first couple of years?
Sure. Yeah, sure. When he started his presidency in 1967, the school was already, the conservatory was already in trouble financially. And by the time he had established the jazz program in 69 or so, the school was close to becoming insolvent. So it was a huge financial crisis. I mean, it was as serious as it could have been. And I think one of the remarkable things about Gunther Schuler's commitment to the program was that he wanted it to be integral to the school no matter what. And he was really willing to let the school go under if it had to go under. But he was not willing to say, okay, well, let's chop this jazz program, Afro-American studies program off so that the school can, have more revenue or spend less money or, those kinds of things. He was very committed to these endeavors that he saw as part of the conservatory's social agenda. So there were kind of ethical reasons to do it. And then for him, there were also obviously artistic reasons to do it. It had to all be of a piece. And he was able to, with lots of help from the staff and the board and some external folks, he was able to bring the school back towards stability.
So one thing I learned from my conversations with Carl Atkins, who was the first, as you know, but as those are listening, but he was the first chair of this department. I learned that the original vision was to create an Afro-American music department where jazz was going to be one part. And over years, as there was more resources and of course, interest from students, because things started pretty small and grew over time, that there would be kind of the expansion of different musical styles and genres that Black people have influenced over time. So I was, I would then later learn that, jazz took hold And of course, as the popularity of jazz programs in conservatories and music schools really took root, that, there were some initiatives that really never got beyond, just holding a class or two. The expansion of the department never really made it as far as Schuler originally envisioned. And just curious if you came across that as well in your research.
I did. I mean, I saw signs of vitality around efforts to extend programming past jazz, and I remember Carl had some different lineups where he had Black classical composers coming in. He had Olatunji come in. He had the Nigerian percussionist. He had, many people thinking, conceiving of an African diaspora approach. He developed essentially a residency program, guest artist program, and had a roster. So we talked about that. I remember in our conversation, but yeah, I don't think it ever achieved. I mean, I found the same thing that you described. It ever achieved the kind of parity with the jazz program where you could see this robust African-American, Afro-American, African diaspora kind of programming with classes and residencies and all the curricular and co-curricular kind of substance that you see, that has been there with jazz for a long time, very consistently.
Interesting. So another thing that I, read from your paper was also the total number of Black students that were recruited into the school. And by creating the jazz department, literally the population went from a handful to, like a real barbecue, essentially. But with that also came changes to the curriculum, the faculty, also the involvement of students across the campus in local Boston neighborhoods. I'm just, curious, what else did you learn about the impact that students had throughout the campus?
Sure. It was quite striking. One of the scholars that I was reading is Noliwe Rooks, and she had done a study called White Money, Black Power of Black Studies programs, and particularly how they were funded by the Ford Foundation and what the Ford Foundation wanted out of them. And one of her findings was that the president of the Ford Foundation at the time, McGeorge Bundy, was really had really turned his back on kind of Black power ideologies, and he was after a specific kind of strategy of integrating campuses and using Black studies programs as tools to recruit Black students into the campus, but with a specific goal of acculturating the Black students and kind of dampening down resistance and protest and that kind of thing. He was trying to distance himself and the Ford Foundation from those more volatile kinds of protest strategies. And I think one of the things about the NEC beginnings that I found really interesting was there wasn't that kind of engineering. So the jazz program had a lot of power, and autonomy to grow in the direction that it was going to grow. Carl Atkins was kind of given say, this is your program, take it and run with it and do your thing. And the students were given that kind of autonomy, and they really took it very quickly. So you saw the climate on campus change fast. I mean, it was within a couple years, students were making demands and wanting to shape the direction of the institution and wanting to have a voice in the institution and being very activist, very politically active. And that was, I think that was special. That was one of the distinctive features of the conservatory that you didn't necessarily see around the country.
Interesting. Yeah, I know that, of course, during this time, I mean, we had the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr., of John F. Kennedy. We also had a lot of protests with the Vietnam War when the US decided to expand the fight into Cambodia, I believe. You had the Kent state shootings. I mean, there were a lot of things that were going on that were putting pressure on the institution. Of course, things happening throughout Boston. But this takes us to, I think, 1971, where I believe this was one of the first kind of Black student unions, but called the Collective Black Artists at NEC. And they wrote a 9-page report of grievances that they wanted Schuler and the institution to address. You just mentioned that. I'm not sure if you can actually remember some of the key points of that, but at the very least, I mean, what impact do you believe that had on the institution and on President Schuler?
Yeah, it was a blow to President Schuler because here he was, having been a champion of jazz music, not only through the conservatory but in other parts of his life, his own performing portfolio, his writing. He has some quite well-known books and articles where he puts jazz forward, as I heard everyone speaking last week about this act of kind of legitimizing jazz among classical audiences. So he was very committed to that and spent a lot of time on it. And he had made a commitment that was really distinctive compared with his peers. But here he was being attacked by the very students that he had recruited or helped to recruit and opened the conservatory to. So he was indignant. He really took it personally. And you can see in the writings when he responded, he gave a nice full response to Siebenek, but he was not happy. And he made that clear, it's like, I really am not okay with the way you're attacking me. He said, use the word, I don't deserve these attacks, essentially, after all I've done to serve this cause. But I think that the concerns that the students were bringing up, and I don't remember the 9 pages, the specific grievances, except I remember this very forceful language. The conservatory is ethnocentric and not recognizing our culture and where we're coming from. The conservatory is too committed to Western classical music and not making room for other kinds of music that are non-Western, and that specifically was tied back to this idea of African diaspora teaching and learning. The students really wanted that. They voiced a concern about it. So I sensed a connection with Carl Atkins and his vision and the vision that he discussed with Schuler at the very beginning of starting the program. But the students wanted more of that, more music coming from different parts of the diaspora, and they wanted to meet more musicians. They wanted more of that in the curriculum. So these were all really, I think, conspicuous pressure points. This was a big deal when the demands were made, and then when President Schuler responded, it's a big moment for the conservatory.
So last week, and we're going to come back to a couple of these things, but last week we heard a good bit about the third stream department, but we didn't really go into much detail about the events that caused instability in the jazz department, like the medium rare band. We kind of touched on that a little bit, but also the racial and political tensions at NEC in the late 70s through probably about the mid 80s. So I'm just curious if you can fill us in on what you learned about that period of time leading up to Hankus Neske's tenure as chair of the jazz department.
Sure. My sense is that the biggest problem was the instability itself, that there wasn't consistent leadership of the jazz program and the kind of changing of hands. I remember Hankus telling me when he took the program over, the person who was running it before him was a graduate student. And it was a woman named Nancy Kennedy, he said, that, she was so good at the work that he insisted as a condition of him taking the job over that she would stay on and be part of the staff. And I remember him saying that she was so unhappy when she inherited the program that it was in such disarray that she had to organize things like auditions, just juries, just normal sort of procedural things that we're all used to, but they had gone missing somehow over those years. So I think that the biggest crisis was just leadership, consistency of leadership. But yeah, the medium rare big band was definitely a moment. And this was a student who started a band that was all white. And he kind of put it in competition in the way he positioned it and juxtaposed it with the band that had kind of been the lineage from Carl's program. And so you had this white band and you had this racially mixed or predominantly Black band. And that was really a trigger for lots of people. As I did my interviews and one conversation after another, people who were here or at the conservatory during that time, they noticed it, they were troubled by it. It didn't feel right. I mean, there was just one testimony after another. And there's a magazine article celebrating the 30th anniversary of the jazz program by Rob Schneider. And that goes into great detail about this period. So my impression is that the medium rare big band, this all white big band that's kind of inserted into the program at a time when it was very volatile and there were a lot of just issues of say, well, you know, who's leading the program and what do we do? And, you know, all those questions are coming up. That was a really vulnerable time. And you can see the racial makeup of the conservatory switch really dramatically. And I wrote it down here because I wanted to make sure I shared this. So in 1979, there were 37 students who identified as Black or African American. In 1981, there were 12. So that kind of precipitous drop, you know, that suddenly is striking. I actually have never seen anything like that in all my years of doing admissions work and recruitment, and that's a pretty dramatic drop, and it feels to me like there was this sort of deliberate effort, not necessarily to say, you know, Black people go away, you're not welcome here, but to say this is no longer about race. This is about the music, because the jazz program never really lost momentum or enrollment. You know, there were always students participating in the program, and they were winning prizes and competitions and everything. So you know, it always stayed really rich. But this part that that Schuler and Carl Atkins and the people of that first generation had committed to, of, you know, this is going to be a way not only of bringing this wonderful music to the conservatory, but also people from the Black community being part of the conservatory community. That part was abandoned.
So it's safe to say that during this time, with the drop of Black students at NEC, that this was an opportunity where the jazz department predominantly turned white.
Yeah.
And I know that there was a correlation in other departments throughout the school, just outside of jazz. You know, some would say that, you know, has NEC really recovered from that time, even today? But I think that there are also some additional factors of, you know, everything from the number of jazz programs that were created at other, you know, conservatories and other schools of music. I think with a lot of the training that happens at the youth level, I think it's safe to say that there were definitely more opportunities and kind of resources given, like, throughout the country to students that were predominantly white that were also competing, you know, at really high levels for seats at places like NEC. And I know that we see that today. I mean, just a couple of months back, I was at Jazz at Lincoln Center with the, you know, the college big band competition that they do. And I was even surprised to see, like, predominantly white jazz bands. It sounded amazing, but it just made me think. I mean, these are the students that NEC's even trying to get at its school,
Sure.
and these students have to be coming from somewhere. So I wanted to. I mean, but before we kind of talk about some of those external threats, I mean, one thing that did change a lot was when Hankus took over the jazz department. And there was a tremendous amount of work that was done. I believe he was the chair for about a decade, from roughly, what was it, the mid 80s to,
yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just curious, you know, how would you describe the impact that Hankus had on the jazz department, and even the legacy that is still around today?
Well, it was a really nice moment to hear from Hankus last week, and Ken and Carl, and Susan. I had met very briefly when she was working on her dissertation And that was the first time I got to hear her speak on a panel. But one of the very gratifying things about everyone's sharing that night a week ago was it was resonating for me from the conversations I had had with them many years ago. So when Henkes said, for instance, I just thought every day, what would Carl do? So I have that on the record too. You know, he used almost the same phrase of, I just thought every day, what would Carl do? And it was clear in his commentary, how much high regard, what high regard he held Carl. So I think that was a key element in Henkes's approach, that he really saw himself as carrying on a particular legacy and a particular way of approaching the jazz program. And his leadership included bringing back some of those residencies. And I think the way Henkes described it to me is he thought of his own heroes, you know, who are the people that he's always looked up to. I remember him mentioning Cecil Taylor, Randy Weston, Melba Liston, you know, people who he really looked up to, and I think, you know, all of us would include those folks on our list. So another thing I remember Henkes implementing during his administration was the Keller Room series. And he told me that at the time he took over, the small ensembles and the jazz program didn't have any playing outlets. And that was really telling to me, because when I came as a doctoral student, the small ensembles were playing everywhere all the time. And to learn that was to a large extent Henkes's doing, you know, implementing that Keller Room series, so that the other thing that I liked about that the period of my doctoral studies was it was kind of intertwined with the chamber music, and you couldn't really pull one apart from the other. And when you walked in that room, you know, almost anything could happen, and it was all very high level. So yeah, I think Henkes was just using Carl's philosophy and way of doing things as a guiding light, and that gave the program a new center of gravity.
So, I mean, yeah, I mean, I would also, you know, add to that. Also, I mean, the care that he took. But the care that he took and really understand was greatly appreciated. I think I might have cut out for a moment. So there have been, you know, several, you know, threats as we started to talk about to the school, but one I really wanted to bring up, and this was highlighted in your paper when Ken Shaphorst took over the department. He talked about there being a new dimension of thinking about race early on in his tenure. And a lot of this was connected to things, you know, again, the financial challenges of the school, but also some of the demographic changes, some of the attitudes. I mean, the challenging of, you know, major court cases on affirmative action, right. Wanting to undo some of the progress so that things could be equal, you know, fair, and not necessarily equitable. Things that, you know, Carl had to do, Henkes had to do, people like Schuler, you know, other presidents of the school to make sure, again, that Black students and even Black music at NEC had an equitable shot. So I'm just really curious. I mean, hearing from you and your paper about this, just what are your thoughts around challenges and external threats, especially when Ken took over?
Yeah, I remember that Bollinger case was going on at the time, University of Michigan, and that was a big turning point, or it seemed like it could be. And as you put it, that a lot of the conventions of affirmative action with which we had lived for decades were under scrutiny and being questioned. And one of the things that I found really helpful, this wasn't my idea, this was probably No Leeway Rooks again. I think it was her, but this idea that there was a new frame for affirmative action, that now it was not in the context of reparations or repairing this wrongdoing, this very particular wrongdoing that has to do with the legacy of slavery and a specific relationship with a specific group of people of African descent brought over as chattel slavery in this economic system that had been created, that the appeal of affirmative action had more to do with this broader agenda of diversity and inclusion, and that it had, it reached out to more people. It had an impact on the institution that was framed in this way. Like, it makes your institution stronger if you're more diverse. That's why you do it, right? And that's a very different motivation than what we had in the 60s, which was, we have this legacy of hundreds of years of oppression and systematic racism, and we're trying to undo it, and we're trying to recognize the wonderful value of this cultural treasure of jazz and put it in its proper place and treat it the way it should be treated. So I think that those two ways of reasoning through affirmative action were very different. And I think if you're in a position like Ken's, where you're recruiting for a program, those are things that you really have to pay attention to, because how are you going to navigate even just the pure legal issues, not to mention the conceptual and philosophical issues, when these kind of arguments are changing right in front of you. So I'll say that much. I mean, that's a distinction that comes to mind for me, and I want to come back to that before we finish.
Sure. The other thing is there's kind of an evolution at NEC of race kind of a Black versus white thing. And there was kind of a departure from this thinking, like when third stream morphed into contemporary improvisation, of NEC trying to become more aware and inclusive of the racial makeup of the US. And, it is something that has become even more complex, but in a great way, where while there are certainly racial equity issues that we're specifically talking about here, in terms of the Black experience at NEC, Culturally speaking, there are so many diverse groups and communities of people at NEC. Overall, the institution will need to get better at understanding those dynamics and responding to them appropriately. And quite frankly, I think even leading musically, a huge opportunity for the institution. So I'm just curious if you could talk a little bit more about kind of that more from third stream to contemporary improvisation and perhaps maybe how NEC's been trying to kind of evolve over the past decade or two.
Sure. I have a particular relationship with the third stream as an idea. A lot of my research deals with that concept as Gunther Schuler presented it, and again with the legacy of what has happened since the 1950s, when there was a community of musicians activated and working around that idea. We belong to the third stream. Here's my contribution. Here's my contribution. Here's my contribution. And it's just to review really quickly. Gunther Schuler thought of the third stream as a place where you'd have a cultural phenomenon like Western classical music, and another one like jazz, which he considered to be both these majestic traditions. And the third stream was this other arena where elements could be drawn from each of those traditions to form a third tradition, a new tradition. And it's a very controversial idea in a way. And I say controversial in the sense that a lot of people will say now, well, that's outmoded, that's from the 50s. Nobody thinks that way anymore. I find it a really fascinating and useful kind of construction because it forces us to keep all of these questions we've been talking about in front of us. How do we get this done? How do we, which strategies do we use when we want to bring these communities together? And in the 60s, when he started the program, both of these programs actually, do you embrace that confrontational kind of protest strategy? Do you embrace more of a reformist strategy? Do you do Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Martin Luther King? Do you do Nation of Islam, Malcolm X? Do you do Stokely Carmichael, Black Power? Do you all of those were in the air at the time that he was forming these ideas and implementing them into the conservatory. And now I think, contemporary improvisation as it's articulated, which is a more expansive, it's not just about African-American culture and white culture. It's about all of these other rich cultural traditions which can be brought in, and a student can come to the conservatory and take from in responsible ways from Indian classical music or Persian music or hip hop or whatever it might be, and really form a personal identity, a personal statement, a personal musical vision in doing that. So it's a great idea, and it's a great way of addressing what we were talking about earlier, how the Supreme Court had shifted to this idea of, it's not about reparations, it's about for Black people with this specific experience. It's about diversity for all people, diversity and inclusion for all people. I think all of these models are useful and they give us a lot to talk about, but they all have their own problems. You know, for instance, in the diversity and inclusion model, I'll speak to what I've learned from my colleagues in Indigenous studies recently. And they all ask the question, well, included in what? You know, because we were here before you were, so how are you going to include us? You know, and that's another very challenging question. So I like, I would say, it's useful to be conversant in these and to kind of mine them for what they're useful for, but also to recognize their limitations and be able to have the flexibility to move to a different model when that's needed.
Yeah, I know that was one of the first questions I had with President Kalin when she called me 2 months ago, which was, you know, I told her up front, you know, I kind of have an issue with this whole diversity, equity, and inclusion, this popular DEI, you know, thing that we talk about, because it's like, well, again, in addition to who's being included in what, but what exactly are we diversifying? Are we, again, trying to get people of color, perhaps women, perhaps LGBT people to, what, along with, you know, what is more widely accepted, or in the majority today? So, I mean, very, very quickly, you know, we really talked about cultural equity. And I think most importantly, how can people feel like they belong in the space?
Yeah.
Because, you know, an institution can do everything under the sun to make it more diverse or to include people. But you actually have to be a person walking in the space when all this inclusion is coming at you, like, you know, please engage. But you actually have to feel like you are supposed to be in that space, engaging with what's around you. And that's another dynamic of the issue to understand, because it's really going to matter how the institution moves forward from here. So with that said, I know I threw a lot of questions at you. What did we miss? What do you want to talk about?
I guess one thing that has come to mind as I've thought about this evening, preparing for this evening, what's been really useful to me, and I think to my students, are some of the theoretical tools that are available to us now that were not available certainly when I was an undergraduate student, certainly also when I was a master's student. They started to pop up around the time I was finishing my master's degree, and by the time I came to NEC in the mid 2000s, they were more available, and I have found them really helpful when I'm teaching jazz history, for instance, and we need to have conversations that are really difficult. You know, they're fraught with all of these complicated issues. And for me, one of the biggest dangers is how personally any of us are going to take these things, these matters, because we're usually talking about ourselves in some way, some way in which we're personally invested. And how do you get through these conversations without feeling exploited or accused or this or that? You know, there's so many vectors when you engage in these conversations. And what I found is these the theory, when students are equipped with it and they're conversant, with it. It allows them to have the conversations about the structures themselves without feeling like they're being insulted if they disagree with each other, or feeling like an idea that someone puts forward is tantamount to a personal attack. So an example I would give is in whiteness theory, you have this idea that that whiteness is not a personal quality. It's not something that well, you're a white person, so you're a proponent of whiteness theory, and I'm a Black person, so I'm not. That's not what it is. It's a structure and a dynamic of power. And the way it works basically is that you don't identify yourself, but you identify other things as other, and that allows you to maintain power. And we actually all engage in that kind of power dynamic all the time, in different ways. So that was a concept where my students and I could start to have these difficult conversations about structure. I said to one student, this is years ago in a jazz history class, why is it that if you're a saxophone major, you do this program, but if you're a jazz saxophone major, you have to do the saxophone program plus all the jazz things? Why is that? And they started, oh, wait a minute. And the way that saxophone lies in this space that's not named, and but the jazz saxophone program is marked. It's like, wait a minute, well, okay, oh, that's interesting. And everyone, is participating in that conversation, and we're kind of going at it. And then one of the students says to me, wait a minute, Dr. Harper, you're the chair of the music department. Like, you're saying these things to us. Why don't you change this? And I said, exactly, why? How am I complicit in this process? How am I allowing these structures to continue? Why would I do that? What could be some of the reasons? And we end up having these really rich conversations that can then lead to, well, what can we do? We want to change these structures. What can we do to change them? And that it takes away a lot of the threat. I think those theoretical ideas are, it's like if you wanted to, you have a screw and you want to put it in a board and you use a hammer, it's the wrong tool. It's important to have the right tools. And when we have those conversations and we're using the right tools, the conversations go well and nothing gets broken. But if we try to hammer the screw, then we're going to break the board. So that's one thing that I've been thinking a lot about.
Well, sometimes you only need the screw to go in that much. But if I were to keep building upon that image, I will say yes, there have been screws put in to try to fix these situations, but they were put in with a hammer. Well-intentioned, sometimes holding stuff together, but not the type of fit, I think, for people to really feel them. And I think that we can certainly say this about the jazz department, where I'll never forget, actually, I believe maybe even during your era, I won't reveal their names because they didn't give me permission, but these were two students in the jazz department playing the same instrument. One was white, one was Black. And the white alum said, I did not get the full understanding of Black and African-American contribution to jazz. And NEC as an institution should completely change their curriculum and all this stuff, because I went through NEC in the jazz department and never got that. The same colleague that was in the department at the same time, that I believe they graduated 1 year apart, said, in the same instrument, said, I'm sorry, but actually, no, I actually got that. And found out that these two students had different teachers.
Right.
Same department, same instrument, same era, but they had two different experiences at NEC. And I would certainly say for one of those students, someone used a screwdriver to put that screw in. And for somebody else, the hammer was used, because actually I went back and looked at the syllabus from that teacher that that student went through. There was stuff sprinkled in there. And I went back and looked at the syllabus of the other student, and it was really clear that that faculty member actually also went above and beyond. So it's certainly one of those where there are instances throughout the institution where there's a lot of really, really good intention to make these things happen, but they aren't felt. And then there are certainly cases where the institution has a lot of work to do in those regards. So let me ask you this question. Let's look out maybe 15 years from now. Dr. Darryl Harper is retiring from heading up the jazz department at NEC. And we are talking about the legacy that you have left, the things that the institution, accomplished over the 15-year period from today. What is it, 2035 or so? What would be said at your retirement ceremony?
Oh, that's a big one. I would hope that my students will feel well equipped with these tools that we were just talking about. I have the hammer when I need the hammer. I have the screwdriver when I need the screwdriver, and that I played a part in helping them figure those out. I think that these problems are not, they're not soluble in any sort of simple way. If we just apply this philosophy, then everything will be okay. Or if we just have this course, everything will be fine. Or if we just hire this person, everything will be great. This work, we've been doing this for hundreds of years, and I feel optimistic. I feel a sense of optimism, or I should say more specifically, I practice optimism, because I think that's an important ingredient. But I see, how if I were born in this body 200 years ago, I wouldn't be able to do any of these things. There are marked kind of milestones of progress that we all know about from our history, but those have been really hard won and really achieved over long periods of time. I remember reading about the Southern Christian Leadership Conference under King and getting this behind the scenes look from some of the research I was doing and seeing the turmoil inside that group and day to day, how hard it was for all of them to do their jobs, how people in an organization that we idealize and we think, if only we could go back to that time. It's like, no, actually, there were people who were excluded, say, from the March on Washington. They weren't allowed to speak because they were gay or they were women. There were internal fights going on that were of such a serious nature that the group could have fallen apart at any moment. When they went down to be on television in front of the fire hoses and everything, that campaign could have fallen apart if Bull Connor had just shown a little bit of restraint and had waited for the television cameras to go away, that would have been the end of the SCLC. There are all these just pivotal little moments that when you really dig into the history, you see how hard it is, how careful it is, how important it is to keep moving and keep pushing that boulder up the hill, and just don't expect a magic bullet or something like that. So for me, those are kinds of important lessons that I want to instill in students. I don't want them to feel discouraged because the progress is slow, because there are setbacks. That's part of this work. So I think if students leave my classes with a sense of how to practice optimism, how to use these tools, how to use the theoretical constructs and the knowledge of history to move this work forward, if they feel a sense of confidence about it, that would be the greatest gift to me.
Well, I would say it sounds like we would say that you push the boulder further up the hill, you put a doorstop underneath it so it wouldn't slide back, so that the next chair could keep pushing it. It's a pretty big hill. No, I would say, I mean, what I took away from this, and one thing I really believe that's going to be important for NEC is that we're all going to have to contribute to the success of the future of the institution, and continue to work, consistently at, trying to refine it and make it better, more inclusive, more diverse, more equitable. But really, I mean, make it a place where it is culturally equitable and really vibrant. And I do think that there is a way to, honor even like where jazz has come from, in addition to how it has evolved over time and how it will continue to evolve. And I do think that there is a way to also honor where classical music or opera came from, but also realize that it has evolved. The people participating and who have contributed and continue to contribute to it, that has evolved, and people have looked differently. And that's going to continue to happen for decades to come. We can't get stuck. And perhaps this is a moment where we have become stuck and we can really do much better in the future. So I know that we talked about a lot of stuff. We've been at it for a minute. I have a lot of hope in the institution, and perhaps, I will leave the last word with you if there's any closing thoughts that you want to share.
I've probably said it already. I mean, I am with you in my high regard for NEC. It's really quite a wonderful institution with an amazing legacy of students and faculty and staff and alumni. And I feel fortunate to have had the chance to be part of the NEC community and to continue to have access to it. It's a real treasure, and these things that we're talking about are critical problems that the conservatory faces, but they're problems that we face around the country and around the world, and they're it's not surprising that the conservatory is struggling with them. I would say that what could be really satisfying for me as an alum of the conservatory is if we could position the conservatory so that it's on the leading edge of this work. That always feels better and that's what the conservatory is used to. That's what draws us there. Oh, NEC is a leader in jazz education, is a leader in, I want to be a symphony player, I want to be an opera singer, I'm going to go to New England Conservatory. If we can make the claim that it's a leader in this work that we're talking about today, I think that would be wonderful.
It took me a moment to. Darryl, I just want to thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, and also for that you took 14, 15 years ago to put together that doctoral studies paper. I do hope that there will be ways for that paper to expand, for us to continue to tell the story, and also hopefully to have you to continue to interact with NEC and its students moving forward. So I just want to say, just thank you again. Stay safe. Hope your family stays safe as well, and encouraged during this time.
All right, thank you.
All right, have a great night.